Can you imagine building a home with your sweat, only to be told you don't belong there? I stood in the living room of the very house I bought, staring at my mother, my brothers, his wife and my cousins gathered like a jury. My brother Hakim pointed at me with a smirk and said, "Adia, you should pack your things. We don't want you here anymore." My chest tightened as if the walls themselves were closing in. This was my home, my dream. How could the very people I sheltered turn against me like strangers? What they didn't know was that I would not just walk away. Adia had always dreamed of building her own house, and when it was finally ready, she felt proud and happy. She wanted her family to share in that joy, so she opened her doors wide. Her mother, her brother Hakim, and his wife moved in, and at first, everything seemed perfect. They smiled, thanked her, and told her how lucky they were to have her. Adia believed this was what family was meant to be, living together, supporting each other, and filling the home with love. But as the days passed, the warmth began to fade. The thank yous grew fewer, and the kindness turned into demands. What once felt like a home filled with gratitude started to feel heavy, as if her family no longer saw her as the one who built the house, but as someone who owed them everything. The joy she had when she first welcomed them slowly turned into silence in her heart, and she realized that the home she worked so hard for was slipping out of her hands. At first, Adia told herself everything was fine, but soon little cracks began to show. The small smiles and words of thanks that once warmed her heart slowly disappeared. One evening, after cooking a meal she had worked hard on, she noticed Hakim's wife pushing her plate away and laughing under her breath. "This food has no taste," she said, rolling her eyes as if Adia's effort meant nothing. It stung, but Adia forced a smile and pretended not to hear. Another time, her mother sat in the living room and complained loudly about how Adia decorated the house. "Why did you choose this color? It looks cheap," she muttered, as if forgetting it was Adia's money and sweat that had built those very walls. Adia tried to brush it off, but the whispers grew louder. She would pass by a room and hear her family talking in low voices, their laughter carrying an edge that cut through her heart. They no longer asked her opinion. Instead, they acted as if she was just a guest in her own home. When she walked into the kitchen, Hakim's wife would suddenly stop talking, her smirk saying more than words ever could. Even her own mother, the woman she thought would be proud, often shook her head and sighed whenever Adia spoke, as if her voice was a burden. Still, Adia chose silence. She convinced herself that maybe they were tired, maybe it was just stress, maybe things would change. She kept working hard, coming home late, hoping to find the warmth she once felt, but instead she found cold faces and colder words. Every night, she went to bed telling herself tomorrow would be better. But deep down she knew something was shifting. The respect she expected from family, the love she thought was unbreakable, was slowly disappearing before her eyes. She held on tightly, not wanting to believe what her heart already knew. This was no longer the home she dreamed of. That night, Adia came home tired from work, carrying her bag with the hope of resting in her room. But when she reached her door, something felt strange. The handle did not turn. She tried again, but the door was locked from the inside. Confused, she knocked softly, thinking maybe it was a mistake. No one answered. She looked around and noticed something even more painful. Her clothes, her books, even her favorite blanket had been pushed into the small storeroom at the back of the house. Her own belongings were stacked carelessly, like they no longer belonged to her. Adia's heart sank. She turned to her family, hoping there was some kind of misunderstanding. But instead of explaining kindly, her brother Hakim looked her straight in the eye and said coldly, "You should give space to the real family. You can look for another place to stay." His wife stood beside him, arms crossed, a small smirk on her face as if she had won some secret battle. Even her mother, the woman she trusted most, avoided her eyes and muttered, "It's better this way." Adia stood frozen, the words echoing in her mind. The real family? Did they no longer see her as part of them? She had built this house brick by brick, yet here she was being told she did not belong. The couch in the living room suddenly became her bed that night. She curled up quietly while laughter drifted from the rooms she once decorated with love. They ate, they joked, they celebrated, as if pushing her aside meant nothing. Every sound reminded her of the painful truth that her own family had locked her out of the very space she created. She stared at the ceiling, tears pressing at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to cry in front of them. Instead, she swallowed the pain, holding it inside like a heavy stone in her chest. That night of humiliation changed something in Adia. She realized she was no longer seen as the owner, no longer treated as the heart of the home. She was now an outsider in her own house. The betrayal was deeper than anything she had imagined, but in her silence, something stronger than tears began to grow. A quiet fire that would soon show her family who truly belonged. Adia lay on the couch that night, staring at the ceiling, her heart heavy with disbelief. The house that once gave her pride now felt strange, like it belonged to someone else. From the rooms down the hall, she could hear laughter, plates clattering, and voices rising in joy. It was the same house she had built with her sweat, but the happiness inside no longer included her. Every sound reminded her that she had been pushed aside, replaced and forgotten. As she shifted uncomfortably on the couch, she looked at the walls she once painted with excitement. She remembered choosing the curtains carefully, saving money for every piece of furniture, dreaming of a family home filled with love. But now all those memories hurt. The same walls felt cold, and the decorations she once adored only mocked her. The rooms she decorated with her heart now held people who acted like strangers, though they carried her blood. Her mother, who once encouraged her to work hard, now looked at her as if she were a burden. Her brother, Hakim, whom she had always supported, treated her like an outsider. And his wife, who had never lifted a stone to build this house, now walked proudly through the rooms as if she were queen. Adia felt her chest tighten, not just from sadness but from the realization that these people, her own family, had betrayed her in silence. They did not shout at her, they did not throw her out openly, but they had taken everything from her by treating her as invisible. She curled under the thin blanket, refusing to let them see her pain. She wanted to believe it was just a bad dream, but deep down she knew it was real. Her home, her safe place, had become a prison where she was no longer welcome. The betrayal was not in words, but in actions, in the way they laughed without her, ate without her, and lived as if she no longer existed. Adia closed her eyes, holding the hurt inside. She told herself she would not break, she would endure the silence, even though it felt like knives cutting into her heart. That night marked a turning point. For the first time, Adia understood that sometimes the deepest betrayals do not come from enemies, but from those who share your name. Adia woke the next morning with swollen eyes, but her face showed no tears. She had learned something important in her silence the night before. Crying would not change anything, and begging for love from people who had already turned their backs on her would only make her weaker. So instead of fighting with words, she chose a path her family would not expect. She decided to stay calm, to smile when they mocked her, and to act as if their insults did not reach her. But behind her quiet face, she was planning carefully. Whenever her mother made harsh comments, Adia wrote them down in a small notebook. When Hakim or his wife spoke rudely, she secretly recorded the conversations on her phone. If they bought things with her money or demanded items in her name, she kept the receipts neatly in a folder. Every tiny detail, no matter how small, she stored as proof. She knew her family had grown too comfortable, believing her silence meant weakness. What they did not know was that her silence was her weapon. At night, when everyone else was asleep, Adia would sit with her papers spread out on the couch. She studied every bill, every document of the house, and carefully placed them in order. The title deed rested safely in her drawer, and every time she looked at it, a new wave of strength filled her. This was not just a house she claimed with her mouth, it was a house that the law itself recognized as hers. Her family might shout, laugh, and even lock her out of rooms, but they could not erase her name written on that document. Days turned into weeks, and though the disrespect continued, Adia no longer felt crushed. Each insult only reminded her to gather more evidence. Each cold look pushed her to prepare harder. Her family believed they had defeated her, but she was building something stronger than revenge. She was building her defense. Deep inside, Adia knew that one day the truth would have to face the light, and when that day came, her family would not just be embarrassed, they would be powerless. She carried her pain quietly, but with each passing moment, her resolve grew sharper. What her family had forgotten was simple. They were living under her roof, and when the time came, she would show them that silence could be louder than any scream. One quiet night, Adia sat outside on the small step near the gate, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She had no one inside to talk to, no one who cared how heavy her heart felt. As she stared at the ground, trying to hold her pain in, a gentle voice called her name. It was Mama Deka, the elderly woman who lived next door. She had often watched Adia grow up, and she could see that something was wrong. Mama Deka walked slowly toward her, holding a shawl around her shoulders. She sat down beside Adia without asking questions at first, just giving her silent company. After a moment, she said softly, "My child, you have been sitting out here many nights. I can see the sadness in your eyes. Do not keep it inside, it will break you." Her voice carried the warmth of a mother's embrace, the kind of comfort Adia had been craving. At first, Adia hesitated. She did not want to expose her shame, but Mama Deka's presence felt safe. Slowly, she shared her story, how her own mother, her brother Hakim, and his wife had pushed her out of her own room, how they laughed while she slept on the couch, how her house no longer felt like hers. As she spoke, tears finally slipped down her cheeks, but Mama Deka only placed a hand gently on hers. Then, with wisdom that seemed to carry generations, Mama Deka reminded her of something her late father had once told the neighborhood children. The one who plants the seed must also harvest the fruit. She looked into Adia's eyes and said, "You built this house with your hands. No matter how they try to push you out, you are the one who planted the seed. And the harvest, my child, will still be yours." Those words sank deeply into Adia's heart. For the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of hope. She realized she was not alone. Someone had seen her pain. Someone believed in her strength. That night, as she went back inside, she carried Mama Deka's words with her like a shield. Her family might have tried to break her spirit, but with those words, her resolve grew even stronger. She knew the seed she planted could never be stolen, and one day, the fruit would be hers to claim. The breaking point came on a weekend evening when Adia returned home to find her house filled with music and laughter. Bright lights shone from every corner, and strangers she had never seen before walked freely through her living room. At first, she thought it was just another of Hakim's careless gatherings, but then she heard him proudly announcing to everyone, "Welcome to my house." The words struck her like a sharp blade. Guests clapped, praising him for his achievement, while his wife walked around as though she owned every wall. Even their mother smiled, enjoying the attention, without correcting the lie. Adia stood quietly by the doorway, her heart pounding but her face calm. She realized this was the moment she had been waiting for. All those nights of collecting documents, saving receipts, and keeping evidence had prepared her for this. She didn't interrupt him, didn't try to argue with the crowd. Instead, she stepped forward with steady steps, holding a neat folder close to her chest. Her family's laughter softened when they noticed her presence, but Hakim brushed it off, raising his glass higher as if to show he was in control. Then, without a single word of anger, Adia handed the folder to a man who had just entered, the lawyer she had quietly called before coming home. He opened it and revealed the title deed, the bills, and every piece of proof. The name on the deed was clear, Adia. The lawyer's voice carried through the noise, announcing the truth with authority. The room froze. Guests who had been celebrating moments ago now exchanged shocked glances. The clapping stopped, the laughter vanished, and all eyes turned to Hakim. His proud smile faded into silence. His wife's confident walk slowed, and even their mother lowered her head, unable to defend the lie. Adia said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence was stronger than any argument. The papers in the lawyer's hands spoke louder than her voice ever could. That night, the house that once felt stolen from her suddenly returned to her in full. It was the turning point, the moment when her family realized they could no longer erase her, or take what she had built. The silence that filled the room that night was heavier than thunder, and it belonged to Adia. A few days after the party, word spread quickly through the neighborhood that something serious was about to happen. Relatives, neighbors, and even friends who had once praised Hakim gathered in the large sitting room. Adia stood at one side, calm and steady, while her family sat together on the other, nervous but pretending to be strong. Everyone was waiting for answers, and the air felt heavy with expectation. The lawyer placed a file on the table and began to speak clearly. He explained that there had been confusion about the ownership of the house, and today, that confusion would end. Slowly he pulled out the title deed, the single paper that carried all the truth. He lifted it high enough for everyone to see, and then read aloud the name written on it. Adia. Just one name, no one else's. Gasps filled the room. Relatives who once believed Hakim's proud stories covered their mouths in shock. Neighbors exchanged whispers, shaking their heads at the betrayal. All eyes turned to Adia, then back to Hakim, who sat frozen in his chair. His wife looked down at the floor, unable to meet anyone's gaze, while their mother's hands trembled as she clutched her wrapper tighter. The same room where Adia had once been humiliated, where she was told to move her things to the storeroom and leave space for the real family, now echoed with a different sound. It was no longer laughter at her expense. It was the weight of truth pressing down on everyone present. The shame her family had tried to bury her in was now their own burden to carry. One of the elders cleared his throat and said, "So all this time, the house was hers." The lawyer nodded firmly, sliding the document across the table toward Adia. She picked it up, her hands steady, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a small, quiet smile. The room remained silent except for murmurs of disbelief. Relatives who once ignored her now looked at her with new respect. Neighbors who had watched her sit outside at night finally understood the depth of her pain. The lie that had been built so boldly was destroyed in a single moment. That day, the truth stood taller than every insult, every humiliation. The house that was once used to break Adia's spirit had now become the stage where her strength was revealed. The days after the public exposure were heavy for Hakim, his wife, and their mother. The truth had spread everywhere. Adia was the rightful owner of the house. Neighbors no longer looked at them with admiration, but with quiet judgment. Relatives who once supported their arrogance now distanced themselves, whispering about how shameful it was to claim what was never theirs. Then came the final blow. Eviction notices signed and delivered, giving them only a short time to leave the house. At first, they tried to deny it, saying Adia was being heartless. Hakim's wife cried loudly, claiming she had nowhere to go. Their mother begged Adia to forgive and forget, reminding her that family should stick together. Even Hakim, who had once stood tall and proud, now lowered his voice, pleading with Adia to give them another chance. They promised to change, to show her respect, to treat her as the owner. But Adia had heard too many promises before, and this time, she was no longer the woman who would break under their words. She looked at them with steady eyes, her voice calm but firm. "A home is not just walls and a roof," she said. "A home is built on respect. And the day you locked me out of my own room, the day you laughed while I slept on the couch, you destroyed that respect. These doors you tried to shut against me will never open for disrespect again." Her words struck harder than anger could. They realized they could no longer control her, no longer twist her kindness into weakness. The same house where they once made her feel small was now the place where their pride crumbled. One by one, they packed their belongings. The same hands that had moved her things to the storeroom now carried their own bags out of the house. Neighbors stood outside watching quietly, some shaking their heads, others whispering about how life had turned. Hakim's wife avoided everyone's eyes, her earlier arrogance replaced by shame. Their mother walked slowly, her head bowed, unable to face the truth she had once ignored. Adia watched from the doorway, not with joy in their downfall, but with strength in her heart. For the first time in a long while, the house felt like hers again. The walls no longer carried the weight of betrayal, but the power of justice. The same doors that were once closed against her now opened wide, for her alone. Adia stood in the center of her living room, the same place where she had once been treated like an outsider. The air was different now. Relatives, neighbors, and friends filled the room, their eyes fixed on her, waiting for her to speak. Her family stood off to the side, their shoulders heavy with shame, their voices stolen by the truth. For a moment, Adia looked around at the walls she had painted, the furniture she had chosen, and the floor she had walked across in both joy and sorrow. Everything that had been used to humiliate her now stood as proof of her strength. She lifted her head and spoke in a calm, steady voice. "You asked me to leave my own house, but today I stand where I belong. This home is not for those who break it, but for those who honor it." Her words carried through the silence, powerful yet gentle, and everyone in the room felt their weight. The crowd broke into applause, clapping not just for her victory, but for her courage. Neighbors who had once pitied her now admired her. Relatives who had doubted her now respected her. The same house that had echoed with laughter at her expense now shook with recognition of her strength. Her family, however, stood frozen. Hakim's proud shoulders slumped, his wife's smirk was gone, and their mother's eyes were fixed on the floor. Without a word, they picked up the last of their belongings and walked out of the house they had once claimed as their own. Their silence was louder than any excuse they could have made. Adia watched them leave, her face calm. She did not gloat, and she did not shout. She simply stood tall, knowing she had reclaimed what was hers with dignity. As the door closed behind them, she felt a peace she had not felt in months. The home that had once been filled with betrayal now belonged fully to her again. It was no longer a place of humiliation, but a place of honor. For the first time in a long while, Adia breathed deeply and smiled, knowing she had not only won back her house but also her respect. This was her final word, and it was enough. If this touched you, share it, because respect builds a home, not walls.